again, we're looking probably at 20 minutes, I think, 20 to 25 minutes of the total scourging in the movie. So you've seen just a microcosm of what is there. And we've even been told by scholars that even to watch the Gibson's film, that it's still not an accurate representation of what Jesus went through in his suffering. And so just bear that in mind as we talk about this. But Dr. Fuller, on what we've just seen, and from what you know about the process of scourging, one, how accurate is this clip, taking into account that we've only seen just a small part? And then can you talk a little bit, just going on, about someone who was scourged in this particular time in history, maybe what they would have gone through, and just speak to that a little bit?
Sure. There's a lot of literary license that goes on in this film, especially when we get to the crucifixion part. But I can tell you that from what I have read about Roman scourging, this is probably the most accurate part of the film. This is exactly what they would have done. The victim would have been undressed, and then they would have had their hands tied to a post, just like in the movie showed us. And then there would be two individuals that were known as lictors, and their whole purpose was to beat the victim to a point of being totally exhausted just before the point of death. Now, this is different than what you would see like in a Jewish scourging. A Jewish scourging, you were only allowed to hit the victim 40 times, and that was later moved back to 39 just in case somebody miscounted. But in a Gentile scourging, which is what Jesus underwent, there was no limitation to the number of blows that could be given. And basically their one goal was to basically make that person as fatigued and as disabled as they could without killing them. And the way they would do this is they would have a lictor on either side, or if there was only one, he would switch sides, and they would repeatedly beat him either with rods or with a special type of whip called a flagrum or flagellum. And I think we have a picture of a flagrum, and this is the closest representation that I could find when I was researching this on the internet. From what I understand, we just have a description of the flagrum. The actual flagrums that they use, of course, most of them were made out of leather, and they didn't survive 2,000 years. But we know that they contain bits of metal, which were either lead or iron. They had little hooks on them, as you can see this one does. They had either pieces of bone or glass that were interwoven into the leather strips. And there could be as little as 3 or as many as a dozen of these leather strips on one of the flagrums. And when this flagrum was swung across the person's back, it was not meant just to inflict pain. What it was really meant to do was to rip the flesh right off the back. So instead of being something like a cat of nine tails or just a whip like you would expect to see on, say, aboard an English naval ship, as a form of punishment, this was not meant as a form of discipline to correct an action that they would walk away from and say, well, I'll never do that again. This was meant to not walk away from and live. When you were sentenced to a scourging, it was a prerequisite to a death sentence. And in a lot of the literature I've read, whenever you were going to be crucified, the scourging was a prerequisite to that crucifixion, because in the process you would lose a lot of blood, and that would weaken you, and that would speed along the death upon the cross. And so it was one of these processes where this was an extremely brutal, savage type of punishment that you were meant to survive it, but only barely. That's the best I can describe it. And the unusual thing here is that, Pilate sentences him to a scourging, and, from what I read, is that this type of punishment was only reserved for the most severe of criminals. Think people like military deserters, murderers, or revolutionaries. And one of the questions I had for Judge Greer is did Pilate or the Roman government or were the powers that be trying to represent Jesus as a revolutionary to the Romans, and maybe in hopes that they would somehow they would punish him to a death sentence. Same as they would somebody who was trying to incite a revolution or so on.
First of all, the scourging had no legal basis whatsoever. I mean, there was no legal basis for it at all. As we saw in the clip here, the Jewish religious leadership did in fact change their tactics when they got before Pilate. I mean, they were accusing him up until that time of blasphemy. But when they got before Pilate and Pilate began to express skepticism about whether Jesus had done anything wrong or not, they changed tactics. They began to accuse Jesus of treason, which in fact was a capital offense under Roman law. Pilate, of course, was still not convinced, and I think the Gospels suggest to us, and I think there's a prophetic reason for the scourging as well, Brandon, you might want to address, but I think that the Gospels suggest to us that Pilate did in fact find Jesus innocent of any wrongdoing. In fact, Luke tells us that both Herod and Pilate found no fault with Jesus whatsoever, and it seems to be the suggestion of the Gospel writers that what Pilate was trying to do here was appease this Jewish mob that was clamoring for Jesus' death, and that he thought that by scourging Jesus, they would give up their demand that he be crucified.
Well, I think the simple answer is that certainly, when it comes to messianic prophecy, there are hundreds of prophecies that were predicted hundreds of years before Jesus was even born, and every one of those messianic prophecies had to be fulfilled. And so we think back to the Old Testament text that says it's through his stripes that we are healed. And so certainly there is that need for the flogging to take place in order for him to be validated in part as the Messiah.